Today's stuff we're going to be learning is Bava Kamma Daf Kuf Bet. Today's stuff is sponsored by Hinder Herman in loving memory of her mother, Ethel Rosenthal's Yurtzeit. Among the many mitzvot my mother performed, the mitzvah Pachnasat Orchim was most dear to her. We miss you every day. Baruch Matir Asurim. Today's stuff is dedicated to the continued good health of the two hostages rescued last night, Fernando Marman and Louis Har. We continue to pray for the safe return of all the others. And I just want to say how exciting it is, in addition to starting the morning in this way, also to the outpouring of women who are interested in learning Masechet Megillah. The last time I checked, sometime last night, and I know more people were added, there were over 1,150 people registered to learn Masechet Megillah in our Megillah challenge. So it's very exciting. It's not too late to start. You can catch up on yesterday's daf if you need to. The idea is to learn the 31 dapim of Megillah in the month of Adar Aleph. So very exciting to see such an outpouring of interest in learning Gemara. Okay, by women and yes, and some men. Okay, we're going to get started with our daf. So we ended yesterday with this issue of kedushat shviit, and I want to make it more clear than yesterday. We're going to get really into this idea about kedushat shviit and how it works. So we started with this contradiction. The second half of yesterday's Amud Bet was that Rava brought up this contradiction. In one Tanaitic source, it says that all these herbs that are used for coloring, not for eating, have sanctity to it. And then we said that wood used for kindling doesn't have sanctity to it. So we tried to figure out, how could this be? Contradiction. We explained, well, it depends. What determines whether items have kedushat shviit or not? I want to also explain what the meaning of if it has kedushat shviit. The beginning of today's daf is a little bit complicated because there's a bunch of nuances that are important to understand. If something has kedushat shviit, that means it can only be used for typical uses. Okay, it can't be used for anything you want, more like usually just eating and things like that. And what we're going to say is, in order for something to have sanctity, it has to be that biuran v'hanaatan shava. That means that while they're getting consumed, that's also when you're benefiting, because that's how food is. So that number one means there's two issues, and that's why it gets a little complicated. One is, does it have sanctity or not? Once it has sanctity, then we can only use it for certain things. We have to be very careful with it. So we're going to now say that using it for dyeing would also be similar to eating, in the sense that when it gets destroyed means it gets absorbed in the clothes. And when it's absorbed in the clothes, that's already when the benefit is, because then the clothes are colored. Then we're going to distinguish that from kindling, because after the wood gets destroyed, that's when it turns into coal. And that's when it's really at its hottest. And that's when you benefit. That's already a later stage, which means, now here's an interesting, and this is important to understand. Once we say that wood, when you burn it, so if you take wood that comes from, let's say, something that could be shmita produce, okay, like we had these alei kanim and alei fanim, which it really depends on for what purpose you gather them. Now, I said for eating, and I said, I don't know why you really would eat reeds. I realized after it's for animal fodder. Animals to eat is like you eating. So if you collect these reeds and the grape leaves, and you collect them for animal fodder, then they're going to have sanctity. But if you collect them for burning, then they're not going to have sanctity, because when you burn them, they're only going to be beneficial after they're already destroyed. Okay, and then they don't have sanctity, and then you can do whatever you want with them. Okay, then there's no sanctity to them. So it's much easier halacha. So now we're going to distinguish between the three. So we have them, they said, okay, now wood is generally burned and the benefits are later. But then they said, well, sometimes you use wood for making an immediate fire, for warmth, something, and it all happens at the same time, to which they answered, and this could be the important start for today's daf, stam itzim la sakai mumdim. Rava said the general use of wood is for kindling, where the hana'ah happens after the biur, after the consumption. The benefit is after the consumption, which means that it sounds like any wood that you cut from a tree that's in the shmita year is not going to have sanctity to it at all, because we go by the majority use of the wood. And here comes the big word, and your intent, what you intend to use it for, is irrelevant. Now, I'm a Rav Kahana, right? Intent always plays a very interesting role in halacha, and sometimes yes, sometimes no, and that's going to be the question here. I'm a Rav Kahana, ve'etzim la saka tinaihi. He says this issue that we just said, we're going to assume all wood doesn't have sanctity, kedushat shviit to it, because general uses you're going to use it is 80% of the time it's going to be used for kindling, and therefore we're going to assume it doesn't have sanctity. Do we really go by this concept now? It's not just wood. Okay, wood we get, but it would be also, for example, grapes. Grapes we make wine out of. Okay, wine is for sure has sanctity. Now we're going to go in the opposite direction. We tried to use the majority to say that we could have a case where, since the majority use is not something that would normally have sanctity, then no wood is ever going to have the sanctity of the shmita. That's the first assumption. Now it's going to be a little confusing because we're going to take a case like wine, where, okay, if I asked you, do grapes have kedushat shviit, you would tell me, absolutely. They're fruits. They're used for wine. They're used for eating. That's, of course, has sanctity in the shmita year. But now we're going to see that it depends what you want to use the wine for. And if you collected those grapes to make wine, to use it for not that purpose, and not a purpose where, now what makes it kedushat shviit? What was our litmus test? If hana'atan and biuran shaveh. As you benefit, as you consume it, you're also benefiting. What if you intend to use, and I'll already give you the example before we read it inside. I intend to use wine. We're going to learn some uses of wine in those days. It's a little bit strange, but they used to soak flax in wine. What would the flax do in the wine? It would get softer. Why would you want it softer? So that when you spin it and then you want to weave it, right, it's softer to use. So they would soak it in wine. Another thing they would do, they would actually use it for laundering. Okay, it seems a little weird to launder your clothes in wine, but perhaps also we talked about the other day that the part of the process of laundering was softening. So perhaps it has to do with that. Let's just take it as an assumption that it was used for those purposes. Now, those purposes, both of them, the benefit is only later. After you soak the flax, you don't benefit right away. You benefit later when you start to weave. When you're talking about the clothing, right? The benefit is not in the cleaning of it. The benefit is in the wearing of the clothing later. Now, one could claim the coloring also, because coloring maybe not right away until you wear the clothes, but somehow they seem to think the coloring is an immediate benefit. Maybe because it's also a benefit. I'm not sure. That's a bit of a question. So now we're going to have a machloket about if I pick those grapes for the purposes of using it for these purposes. Now, if it has sanctity, I'm not allowed to soak it and, soak my flax in it, because that's not a typical use. But if I say that my intent is important and plays a role here, then even though most wine is used for eating, just like most wood is used for kindling, and again, here we come to the opposite conclusion. Most what wood is used for kindling would get you to the conclusion there is no kedushat shviit. Most wine is used for eating would get you to the conclusion there is kedushat shviit. So here's going to be a machloket about this issue as relates to wine. And the assumption is it would be the exact same thing as relates to the wood in the opposite direction. Again, wood, no sanctity, and wine, always sanctity, even if you're using it for something else. Always sanctity would mean you cannot use it for soaking your flax because it's sanctified no matter what, and therefore you can't use it for this atypical use. Now, Ditanya, so let's read it inside. Here's the braitot that's going to show. Do we go by majority and your intention is not relevant? Or do we say your intention is relevant? Is a machloka between Tanaim. Ein moslim perot shviit lo lemishcha velo lekfusa. Okay, according to Kamma, you're going to understand this already. You cannot use shmita produce like wine for soaking the flax or for cleaning. Why? Because you picked it, they're grapes, they have kedushat shviit. We don't care what you intended to use it for. It has sanctity. Once it has sanctity, it can be used basically for eating, not for using it for some atypical purpose. This, by the way, there's a whole issue with shmita produce. Are you allowed to use fruits that generally, this is actually a fascinating question, fruits that generally aren't, that you don't generally crush. You don't usually use in a shake, okay? Are you allowed to make a shake out of them? Because that's an atypical use. Now, I always think it's kind of funny because nowadays shakes are so in and you can make shakes out of anything. And perhaps that changed, but in the Gemara, it was an issue that you can't make a juice out of something that normally you don't make juice out of. So I think in the last, 20 years or something, that whole world has changed because people make juice and shakes out of anything, even things that they didn't typically used to do. So perhaps now it's all okay. So it's interesting, right? Perhaps in ninjas, exactly. So anyway, it's an interesting idea that is one of those things that kind of changes depending on the time, because it all depends on the typical uses. And that's a good question. Is it a typical use? Is it not? The fact that some people might put some weird fruit in a shake, does that mean, and do you go by the typical? Let's say you put something atypical. It's an interesting question. But that's the basis of this idea that when it has sanctity, you can't just use it for anything. Rabbi Yosi says, you can do it, no problem. So now we're going to explain the reason. So again, the real reason of Rabbi Yosi is because he says, if your intent was, he thinks intention is an issue here. If you intended to use it for soaking, then it doesn't, right? Then basically we're going to say, if it, I'm sorry, I'm just getting confused for one thing. Right. We're going to go by the atypical use, and it just won't have kedushat shviit. If it doesn't have kedushat shviit, of course, you can use it to soak your flax. Okay, that's what he's going to say. But there's going to be one caveat here. Okay, and this is where it's going to get confusing, and I'm going to say it right now ahead of time so you know where we're going with it. This is only, we're going to see in the Gemara soon, you can only go by your intent. Okay, let's get this right. You can only go by your intent if it's something that is used by everybody, meaning it's a typical, okay, now it's a little weird because we already said it's a bit atypical, but it's something that is used by everybody. When we get to something that's meant, let's say, only wealthy people do it, or only sick people need it, then your intent can't play a role. Okay, and then it's going to go back then to the fact that it's got kedushat shviit to it. If it's something that's got only affects, let's use our 80-20, 20% of the people, then you can't say my intent is going to change things. So in that case, it's going to go back to having kedushat shviit. It's a little tricky how to read this. Hopefully when you see it inside, it'll be more clear. So first we're going to go through the ping pong of the psukim. How do they learn this from the psukim? My time of the Rabbanan, I keep using these 80-20 because my daughter's doing a project for this 80-20 theory of the world. So in my head is this 80-20, how 20% of the people in the world have 80% of the wealth and all those kind of things. So I have this 80-20 in my head. That's all we were talking about all Shabbat. Okay, so my time of the Rabbanan, amarkra le'ochla velo le'mishcha, le'ochla velo le'kfusa. So where do the rabbis get it from? They say shmita produce, according to the pasuk, is by Shabbat haaretz lachem le'ochla. The produce of the shmita year. You have to remember how this works. Okay, for people who are less familiar with shmita, on the 7th year, you're not allowed to work the land. You don't work the land, but things grow anyway because we have things that grow in the shmita year, especially fruits and things like that. They don't need to be planted from year to year. Well, you can eat them. You just can't sell them. And you can't use them for other uses other than eating. This is where we get, don't use it for atypical uses. So come the rabbis and they say it's very simple. Le'ochla, what does le'ochla come to exclude? It obviously comes to exclude something. To exclude le'mishcha, le'ochla v'lo le'kfusa. You can't soak your flax in it. You can't wash your clothes in it. For Rabbi Yosi Omil, what are you talking about? You didn't look at the pasuk well. Amar kra lachem. It says lachem le'ochla, for you to eat. It could have just said vayat le'ochla, for eating. Why does it say for you? To teach you, for anything you need. You need it for flax. You can do flax. You need it for, right? You can use it for all your needs. Now, it's a little tricky because it's different reasons, right? In other words, you can use it to eat if it's got kedushat shviit. If it's not kedushat shviit, then you can use it for flax. And how is it not going to have kedushat shviit? Well, if you intended for it not to be used for eating, then it doesn't have kedushat shviit. For Rabbanan nami haktiv lachem. What did the rabbis ping pong the psukim? Now, what do they do with lachem? Lachem dumiyad le'ochla b'mishan ha'atanu b'yuran shavim. Lachem means for you to eat. Why the lachem? It says it's to say, well, it does include something additional, but in order for you to be able to use it, it has to have an atanu b'yuran shavim. And mishra and kfusa is not in the same way as eating, so you cannot do those things. Yatsu mishal kfusa shanatan achar b'yuran. So those can't be used for. You can't use shmita produce for that. And therefore, again, the rabbis are going to say, this has kedushat shviit. Your intent doesn't make a difference, and therefore you can't use it for these things. But Rabbi Yosi is going to say, no, if you intend it for something else, that's not an atanu b'yuran shavim, then you're going to end up with something that's not kedushat shviit at all, and then you're going to be allowed to do it. For Rabbi Yosi, nami haktiv le'ochla. What does he do with le'ochla? Because le'ochla seems to be limiting, right? He says lachem is included, but le'ochla is limiting, so what are you going to limit? Amar lecha, here comes the thing about sick people and wealthy people. He says the le'ochla comes to exclude something else. And that's the thing that we're going to say is eino shaveh l'chol adam. Things that are not typically used by everybody in the world, those things are not going to be included. So those things, again, what does it mean not included? It means you can't say if I picked it for this purpose, then it's not going to have sanctity. No, it's going to go back into the category of having sanctity, and then you'll be forbidden to do it. L'chei d'Tanya for the following braitot. D'Tanya, le'ochla v'lo le'melugma. Okay, melugma, if you want to remember what this means, it's what we call notrikon. It's like an abbreviation of two words, melo lugmav. Melo lugmav is a cheekful. Comes up in Pesach, how much to drink. It comes up in Shabbat, how much to drink. Anyway, I'm sorry, Yom Kippur, not Pesach, Yom Kippur. How much of drinking is forbidden. Comes up in Shabbat, how much kiddush you're supposed to drink. But what does it mean here? Well, melo lugmav is your cheek. It's where you chew things. So they would chew up fruits, and then they would put it in a wrapping for medicinal purposes. If you had certain wounds, they would do that. So that's a melugma. It's for sick people. So now they say, so le'ochla means you can't use it for this type of bandage. Oh, no, so they say, wait, this is a classic midrash halacha. It says, this word is coming to exclude this, and then it suggests, maybe not. So this braitot says, maybe it means le'ochla and not for laundry, which would be against Rabbi Yosi. And remember, this is Rabbi Yosi's proof, and that's because they're going to reject that. And that it's not his proof, it's what he does with the word le'ochla. The le'ochla doesn't come to exclude laundry, it comes to exclude something else. So now he's going to, right, this is the braitot, but it's as if it's Rabbi Yosi talking. Lachem comes to include fusa. Le'ochla comes to exclude melugma. Okay, this is our classic. We have one word that includes, one word that excludes. We're going to say this includes that, this excludes that, and then we're going to say why. It seems a bit random. Why that one, not that one? And then we'll come up with our answer, which I already told you. So that's what we're going to do. That one includes, that one excludes. So why is kfusa allowed, laundering allowed, but melugma is not allowed? Very simply, they're going to say, we're going to allow, again, this is also just logical. If you're going to permit something, you may as well permit something that is for everybody. But we're not going to exclude, we're not going to include things that are only for 20% of the community. So the sick people who need this is only, let's say, 20%. Now we're going to see some other things. They're going to bring a braitot. With this, we're going to end this section. Kamman az lahad d'Tanya, according to, is the following braitot. Is it the rabbis or is it Rabbi Yosi? Le'ochla v'lo le'melugma, le'ochla v'lo le'ziluf, le'ochla v'lo la'asot mimenu apik tvizin. So what is this? Le'ochla v'lo le'melugma we already know. Le'ochla v'lo le'ziluf. They would take wine and they would pour it on the floor in order to make a nice smell in the house. So you can't do that with perot shviit. Now, why is that? You have to say these are all things that are eino shaveh l'chol adam, because that's what wealthy people would do. Okay, poor people didn't take wine and pour it on the ground. They would drink their wine. They would no way waste it for a nice smell in the house. Lochla and not abiktvizin. This is someone who's sick, who has a lot of phlegm or mucus in there. They would drink this thing and it would kind of allow them to spit out all this. It would cause like the expulsion. I actually looked up, it's called expectoration, which is very similar to abiktvizin. It's a similar sounds. I don't know if there's any connection, but it's basically causes all those fluids to get out. So again, that's for sick people. So those are all limited. So who is this source according to? It's obviously Kamman Rabbi Yosi. The rabbis exclude way more things than that. They exclude mishra, they exclude kedushat, even things that are across the board for everybody. They still exclude them. Why? Because even though it's across the board, now it's tricky because there's things that might be across the board for everyone, but still 80% of the use of wine is only for drinking. This is only 20% of the use. It's just 20% of the use of wine, which is for 100% of the population. So since it's for 100% of the population, Rabbi Yosi says, if that was what you intended it for, then it won't have sanctity and you can use it. The rabbi said, I don't care what your intent is. 80% of the use of wine is for drinking. All grapes are therefore going to have sanctity to them. So that's how, that was all to just prove that there's a machloket tanaim about this issue. Again, whether, now let's go back to the beginning, stam Do we say that because, I think everyone thinks that stam eitzim are lasakam, but the question is, do we therefore say any use of burning, even if hanatanu biyulan shavim, we're going to say, since the 80% of the use of the wood is for burning in a way that you want to get coals, whether natan biyulan or not shavim, we're basically going to say any wood never has sanctity of the shmita year, even though theoretically you might be using it and your intent is for 20%. Well, Rabbi Yosi would say, no, if your intent is to use it for something, then it would have sanctity to it and you wouldn't be able to use it. So again, Rabbi Yosi is lenient on the wine, but strict on the wood. And the rabbis are strict on the wine. They're strict on the wine and lenient on the wood, because it all depends on what the majority use is. Okay, and the question is, do we follow majority or do we follow your intent? Which is very interesting. Now we're going to go on to the next section. Rabbi Yosi omer l'masheva. So now we go back to the Mishna, and the Mishna had this case where I give you my wool to dye. I want you to dye it red, you dye it black. And if you remember, Rabbi Meir said, you are like a gazlan, you're like a thief because you did the wrong thing. You acquire the item and you just give me back the value of what I gave you. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, you changed, okay? And this is, we're going to see it in a Mishna in Bava Metzia. It says, Kol ha'mishaneh yado ala tachtona. Anyone who doesn't do what they were asked to do, they don't benefit, okay? And we even have Rashi who said it's a knas, like maybe theoretically the halacha should be like Rabbi Meir, but there's no way we're going to let you have that nice dyed wool that you basically misused. You have to give it back to me, and I pay you the least amount possible. Either I just pay you back for your expenses, or I pay you for how much it went up, whichever one is lower. So now we have a story. Yatav Rav Yosef b'chorei de Rabbi Abba kamei de Rav Huna. So Rav Yosef is sitting behind Rabbi Abba in front of Rav Huna. They're both in his Beit Midrash. But Yatav Rav Huna b'kamar. Rav Huna says the following thing. Halakha Rabbi Yehoshua ben Karcha. We have no idea yet what he's talking about. And halakha Rabbi Yehuda, which is obviously the Rabbi Yehuda of our sugya, otherwise this wouldn't be here. Hadrinu Rabbi Yosef la'apit. Rabbi Yosef turns around like an act of disrespect to Rav Huna. Amal. And he says the following. And we're going to cut this sentence in the middle to just explain what we're talking about, because we have no idea yet what Rabbi Yehoshua ben Karcha is. Bishlama, it makes sense, Rabbi Yehoshua ben Karcha. Itzrif. I understand why you said we paskin like him, because you needed to tell us. I wouldn't have known otherwise. Okay, and then we're going to stop and get to the Ella. What I don't understand and why I got upset, we'll get to in a minute. But let's see why Rabbi Yehoshua ben Karcha, because you would have thought, generally we have a principle. If you have a majority against a single opinion, we're always going to follow the majority opinion. And in this case, Rabbi Yehoshua ben Karcha disagrees with the rabbis. They're the majority. I would have thought we held like the rabbis. You needed to tell us, no, in this case, we don't. We hold by an individual opinion, right? Kamashma, and that's why you told us halakha ki yachid. Now, before we go on with the sentence and say, but I don't understand why you told us halakha ki Rabbi Yehuda, is totally unnecessary. First, we can explain what is this halakha of Rabbi Yehoshua ben Karcha, total tangent. So now we're talking about halakha of idol worshippers. Idol worshippers had certain holidays, and there were certain things that you weren't allowed to do just before their holidays, because there was a concern that they were going to go praise their gods because of you. And it says in the pasuk, I don't remember the exact wording, but lo yikareh, you can't have the name of the gods al picha, on your mouth, which really means, I think it's something like, if I didn't get the words wrong, but what it basically means is you can't cause the name of their gods to be called up. Now, if you do something good for them that's beneficial for them, then they're going to go, if it's right before their holidays, they're definitely going to praise their gods for it and thank their gods. And therefore, you're kind of responsible for that, and you can't do it. So Rabbi Yehoshua ben Karcha says the following, Ditanya, Rabbi Yehoshua ben Karcha, right, they want to know, Rabbi Yehoshua ben Karcha Mahi, what's this opinion you're referring to? Ditanya, Rabbi Yehoshua ben Karcha Omer, Milveh bishtar, I loaned a Gentile money, and they pay me back. Well, ein nifra'im mehem. Okay, if it was we had an IOU, we had a document, signed document that the Gentile owed me money, I can't collect it within a few days of their holidays, 3 days of their holidays. Why? Because there was a concern. Now, when somebody pays back a loan, they're very excited, right? It's like a big relief. Okay, so you're very relieved you no longer have this loan, and we're worried the Gentile is going to go thank their gods on account of me. But milva al peh comes from Rabbi Yoshua ben Karcha, and he said, but we're going to be lenient if it was an oral loan, because if they're coming to give you back the money, you better take it right away. Because if there's no documentation, they'll probably never pay you back. So if they're coming to pay you back, take it right now. because you're actually taking money away from them, which is also considered like then they have less money to, let's say, go buy offerings for their gods, or possibly it's connected with that. But the point is, you thought you'd never see that money again anyway. So take it right now. Now, the rabbis disagree and say even that you can't. But there we pass like Rabbi Yoshua ben Karcha. Okay, so I get why you told us that, because you might have thought we hold like the rabbis. Ela halakha ke Rabbi Yehuda lamali. But why did you tell us halakha ke Rabbi Yehuda? Now, why not? It's a machloket with Rabbi Meir. How would we know who to follow? One against one. Well, he says we have all these rules about how we paskin. So one of the rules is machloket v'achar kach stam hi. Machloket v'achar kach stam halakha stam. If you have a machloket in a Mishnah, and after that there's a stam Mishnah unattributed without a machloket that says the halacha according to one side, we always paskin if it's in the order of machloket and then stam. We're always going to paskin like the stam opinion. And our Mishnah is a machloket in Bava Kamma, litzbo lo adom utzvao shachor, shachor utzvao adom, Rabbi Meir omer, now we're just quoting the Mishnah. Noten lo dmet samro, Rabbi Yehuda omer, mashevach yetra litzia, noten et yitzia, mitzia yitra l'shevach, noten lo et hashevach. Okay, I already went through that. We're not going to explain the opinions again. That's a machloket in Bava Kamma. Now, fast forward to the next Masechet, Bava Metzia. And in Bava Metzia, it's a stam Mishnah, like Rabbi Yehuda, because it says in Bava Metzia, Ditnan, kol mishaneh yado ala tachtona. If you hire someone to do something and they change from what you hired them to do, they're on the underside, meaning they'll have to pay you, right? In other words, you'll end up, whoever made the change, they lose out. Okay, which means Rabbi Yehuda basically. All depends on what the Yitzhak and what that says, how much you need to pay them, you pay them the least amount. So if that's the case, and so Kol Mishnah Yadola Tachtona, they just quote you the continuation of the Mishnah, which is Kol HaChozer Bo Yadola Tachtona. If you hired someone and then they ditched you in the middle of the day or something, right? They have the underhand because they didn't do their part of the agreement. So therefore, it's a machloket, then there's a stam, and it's obvious we hold like Rabbi Yehuda. Why do you need to tell us the obvious? It's interesting to get so angry at someone for telling you the obvious, but he basically says that. Rav Huna, so what's Rav Huna's retort going to be? It's doing. Fascinating line. Maybe there's no order to the Mishnah, okay? And therefore, maybe you could say the Mishnah Bava Metzia comes before the Mishnah Bava Kamma. Now, not so crazy. I mean, we always talk about how the Gemara is not linear. It doesn't read from start to finish, and things aren't, right? Maybe we just don't view this as an order. The problem with saying that, obviously, is the next line, which is Rav Yosef is going to retort to that. Then anytime you have there is a principle. It's like saying the Torah doesn't have an order, but then they learn things from the order. So if you learn things from the order, there's a principle. Machloket and then stam, right? It's not stam and then machloket, that would be different. Sounds like a klalu prat and a pratu klal, right? So if you hold there's a principle like this, which everybody agreed to, then obviously there's an order. You can't say there's no order. To which Rav Huna will answer, Rav Huna kilo amrinan, it's a double negative, so it's a little tricky line to get. Kilo amrinan ein seder the Mishnah. When we don't say there's no seder in the Mishnah, which basically double negative means we say there's an order to the Mishnah. When does that work? Stam machloka v'achar kach stam works. Bechad Masechet, within one Masechet. Now that's in the next Masechet, Bava Metzia. Bava Kamma is one Masechet. We do take order into consideration within a Masechet, but we don't take order into consideration, right? Then we say, but aval betray Masechtot amrinan. But in two Masechtot, it's tricky. We say there is no order. Okay, it's tricky because it's the negative. We do say there is no order. Okay, and that's why he thinks that this isn't a case of machloket v'achar kach stam, and it was so obvious, and that's why he needed to tell us. He still thinks that halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda, but you wouldn't have known it from the principle. To which Rav Yosef has a good retort to this. We're going to have two possible retorts. One is kulan ezikin chad masechtehi. We talked about this the first day of Bava Kamma. Bava Kamma, Bava Metzia, Bava Batra were all one long Masechet. You can't say there's no order. These are two different Masechtot. It was actually one long Masechet that was split up. Some people actually read this to say all of Seder Nezikin was one long Masechet, not just Bava Kamma, Bava Metzia, Bava Batra. The entire thing was one Masechet, which is fascinating in and of itself. Anyway, a side point. Or Ibait Ema, and therefore you're wrong about your principle. And therefore, Ibait Ema Mishum Tekatani Lagabe Hilchot Psikta. Perhaps Rav Yosef was convinced for a different reason. Not because of machloket v'achar kach stam, but because it was in a Mishnah with another halacha that's agreed upon by everybody. That's halacha psuka. Everybody agrees kol hachozer bo yado ala tachtona. So therefore, kol mashaneh, we must paskin like that also. So that was an aside where basically Rav Yosef says, I don't understand why here we get to learning about principles of how we paskin halacha. And seeing that they think if something's so obvious, it shouldn't be said, which is a little bit strange because you would think sometimes you need to teach things that are obvious. Anyway, Tanu Rabbanan, moving now to Amud Bet. Now we have a braitot. New topic or new case, which is going to be similar to our case of the wool and the dyeing of the wool. I hire you likach lo chitin, to buy me wheat. V'lakach mehen solim, but you bought barley. Okay, I don't know if this happens in your house. You send someone to the store and you get not exactly what you wanted to get. So that's what seems to be happening here, although we'll see soon that it's not exactly like that. Solim v'lakach mehen chitin, where you wanted barley and you ended up getting wheat. Tanya Chad, in one braitot, it says, Im pichato pichato lo v'im otiru hutiru lo. This sounds like Rabbi Meir. What did Rabbi Meir say? You changed. So if you changed, then basically what do you have to do? You didn't do what I said. So you keep what you bought and you give me the money back, which means that's the same thing. That's Rabbi Meir in our Mishna. You just give the value of the wool. What does it say here? It says it, but in other words. That means the chitim you bought or the sorim you bought, whichever one, are yours now, which means, and that's what it says here, in pichato pichato lo. If they go down in value, it's your loss. If they go up in value, it's your gain because they're now yours. Why? Because you changed, you acquired them, and in acquiring them, you basically just had to return me my original money because you didn't do what I asked you to do. V'tanechada in pichato pichato lo v'imotiru hutiru lem. So this one's going to be a little more difficult to understand. The other braitot says if they went down in value, it's your loss. But if they go up in value, you have to split the proceeds with me. So you'll see in a minute that the Gemara is going to suggest or explain that what was happening here really is that it wasn't like I sent someone to my house to the store because I wanted some food to eat and they brought me the wrong thing. It was that I wanted to do a business deal and I basically gave you the money. I told you, go buy something that we can sell and that we can invest in and then sell for more money. And you bought the wrong thing, okay? And then if it goes down in value, it's your loss. If it goes up in value, we split it 50-50 because that was the deal in the beginning. We were supposed to split it 50-50, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So on Rabbi Yochanan lo kasha, ha Rabbi Meir, ha Rabbi Yehuda. So Rabbi Yochanan says, okay, this is very simple to resolve the contradiction. One is Rabbi Meir, which we already explained the first one, and one is Rabbi Yehuda. So let's read it inside. Ha Rabbi Meir damar shino kona, that's what we said. You change, you acquire, and that's why all you have to do is return me the money. You keep the wheat, goes up, goes down, it's all your gain or your loss. And the second source is Rabbi Yehuda, ta'amal shinoi eno kone. If it's not kone, then, and Tosdo basically explains what I did, which is this was obviously a business dealing. And therefore, we just go back to the original business deal. But since you bought the wrong thing, if you lost, it's all on you. Because you didn't do what I asked you. You took my money, you invested in the wrong thing. This is a good question, like what happens in the business world when this happens. If the person who's supposed to invest the money invests in something they didn't agree on and it goes down in value, is it all on the person who did the investing? If you gained, well, that was the whole idea. We were supposed to gain money. So yeah, you bought something different, but it made money. So great. We split it 50-50 because he doesn't hold that Shino is Kone. So if Shino is not Kone, then of course we split the benefits 50-50. That's the first explanation. Matkifla Rabbi Elazar. That's Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Elazar says, what are you talking about? Me, mine. Why are you assuming this is a machlok between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda? Why don't we just explain them both according to Rabbi Meir? And we're going to distinguish exactly the distinction we made, and that will be a significant distinction. Dilma adkan lo kama Rabbi Meir ela b'midi dechazeh legufe. Rabbi Meir said shino is kone when it's something that you wanted milk in your house and they bought you soy milk and you don't like soy milk and you didn't want that, and you say that's not what I wanted. So then shino is kone. You get the soy milk, you give me back my money so I could go buy the milk that I wanted. But if we were doing a business deal, Rabbi Meir wouldn't say the same thing. Why not? Because in the end, what's the purpose of a business deal? It's not that I care whether it's soy milk or regular milk. I just want what's going to make the most money. So if it made money, great, I benefit. It doesn't matter to me so much what I buy. It's not like it's my own personal preference. I thought maybe wheat would be better than barley, but if the barley happened to go up and we made a profit, great. So therefore, you can explain it all according to Rabbi Meir. Now, so therefore, the two cases are talking about different situations. Two braitos. Now we're going to have a side question, which is going to lead us to another topic, which is in Eretz Yisrael, they made fun of Rabbi Yochanan, aliba to Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yochanan's explanation of Rabbi Yehuda, that braitot, reading it like Rabbi Yochanan, according to Rabbi Yehuda, is a problem. Why? Well, let's go according to Rabbi Elazar, because then you'll understand the point. According to Rabbi Elazar, the shaliach did what I asked the shaliach to do, which is make an investment. Maybe not the best investment, right? Maybe, or that was the whole thing. So if it goes down, well, it's your problem because you didn't do what I asked you. If it goes up, I'm going to benefit because in the end, they kind of did what I wanted to do anyway. But according to Rabbi Yehuda, they didn't do what I wanted, right? I wanted soy milk or regular milk, and you bought me soy milk. That's not what I asked you to do. Now, according to Rabbi Yehuda, I gain anyway because, right, we did this investment together. But according to this, really, you changed. You did something I didn't want. What rights do I have to this object? And he's going to say the following. In the end, what you did was you basically went to a seller. You said, I want to buy this. Now, it wasn't what I wanted to buy. You said, I want to buy soy milk, when really I wanted regular milk. Now, you went and asked for soy milk for me. Now, in the end, what we're saying is, I get 50% of the benefits of that, of the proceeds of the soy milk. But in the end, I didn't want this. You didn't do my shlichut, right? How could the seller has to get me to acquire it, right? They're basically selling something. They have to kind of give it to somebody. Now, when you act as my messenger, my agent, you function like me. But here you didn't do exactly what I wanted. So how do I get any rights to this at all? Because again, what does it mean? Kol mishaneh. Shinoi is koneb. You acquired it because you did something different. If you acquire it, and theoretically you should have really acquired it because you didn't do what I did. He gave it to you. He didn't sell it to me. And you're not really acting as my shaliach because you didn't do what I asked you to do. So it doesn't really make so much sense. So let's read in the words, who told the Baal Chitim about me? Nobody told them that I was in existence here. It was a deal between you and the seller. And the seller thought he was giving it to you. And you weren't acting on my behalf because you didn't buy what I wanted. So no, it's not a problem according to Rabbi Elazar because he explains the whole thing is a business deal, and anyway, it's in my own benefit for the business deal. It's good for me anyway if it went up in value. So that would make sense. You're still doing within the realm. But Rabbi Yehuda, according to Rabbi Yochanan, didn't agree with that. You're not doing what I wanted you to do. So first, now this is a bit of a weird question, maybe because I explained too well the first part, but he says, if you go by, like, he understood the question as if the problem is that you're buying on my behalf. And the seller, even if I asked you to buy wheat and you bought wheat, or I asked you to buy milk and you bought milk, cow's milk, then the seller who sells you the produce is selling it to you, not to me. How does it ever work in shlichut? To which they answer, I'm a Rabbi Abahu, shani chitim b'chitim, de shlichut kavit. No, it's a difference. If you do what I asked you to do, then you're functioning on my behalf. Then you're like the balabayit, okay? But if you do against what I asked you, not what I asked you to do, then how on earth do I acquire it? That's his question. And now he's going to prove that if it's in my best, and if you do what I asked you to do, it will obviously go to that person. Let's prove it. Okay, this is a strength to what Rabbi Abahu said, that when it's chitim and chitim, of course it would work. And he proves it, it's none from the following source. If I give all my, okay, I'm going to have to be a man in this story. So a man gives all of his possessions to the temple, promises to the temple, or promises his value to the temple. All that man's possessions go to the temple. Okay, or if we'll get to the evaluation after. But if the man says, everything I own goes to the temple, it doesn't include the clothing of his wife, the clothing of his children, the shoes he bought them. It doesn't include wool he had dyed for them. Now, if there's an issue that's how do those items belong to the woman and the children? Because the assumption is, right, and now here's interesting in terms of those days, they're assuming the man went to the dyer to get the clothing dyed for the wife and to get the wool dyed. He brings his wife dyed wool, and it's considered like hers. Now, here's a whole question. Women don't really have their own stuff. Well, we're going to see that they're going to reject this interpretation anyway. perhaps for that reason as well, but that's not the reason they're rejecting it. But they basically say, if the man says all my possessions, it doesn't include that, even though the guy didn't say to the dyer, this is for my wife, the wool that you're dyeing. But if he dyed wool for his wife's sake, it's hers. So it must be because don't we say it's because he was doing it on behalf of his wife? And if you're doing what they want, then you can acquire it. The buyer doesn't need to know. That's all we're trying to prove here. That the seller doesn't need to know who he's selling it to in the event that you're doing it on their behalf as an agent, as opposed to if you're not doing what they said, and there's really the big question. So that's why we would say here, if I told you to buy wheat and you bought wheat, then the seller doesn't need to know about my existence because you're just doing exactly what I want. But now we're going to reject this proof. I'm a Rabbi Abba. Low. The reason this doesn't work is not because of the reason why it doesn't cover the wives' clothes, and they can't take away the wives' clothes and the children's clothes, is because it's just because when I sanctified and when the man sanctified in the beginning, all of the man's possessions, he intended the man's possessions, not things that his wife or his children would, because why would he do that, right? He doesn't want to leave them walking around naked, so he just didn't include those things. So we assume, now here's an interesting assumption, the Gemara is going to question that, anything that you don't think he really meant to sanctify isn't included. Now that's a bit of a complicated thing, because they're going to say, what, you think he included his tefillin? And let's look at this source. Utnan, it says in the Mishna, if you sanctify all your possessions, you have to give your tefillin to the temple, which means you'll give the value of your tefillin, but you have to give them. We don't say, oh, obviously you didn't include your tefillin, because why would you do that? You need your tefillin every day. So that's not a good reason to explain the wife and the children. Obviously, the man didn't think about it in the first place. So he says, no, you really intended your tefillin. Why? Okay, and that therefore it's not a contradiction against what Rabbi Abba said. He thought it was more important to sanctify all of his items than to make sure he had tefillin to wear every day. Okay, but now he's going to distinguish. Tefillin you intended to include, but your wife's clothes and your kids' clothes. Imagine the hullabaloo in that house. The wife's going to say, what do you mean you just gave away all my clothes? The kids are going to say, what do you mean you just gave away all my clothes? There'll be huge fighting in the house. You can just imagine the scene. And of course, the man didn't intend for that to happen. And that's why we can explain Rabbi Abba in that way. But we're going to have a second problem with Rabbi Abba's distinction. When you do what the person wanted, right? So now we're going to say, again, this was to reject Rabbi Abahu. This was Rabbi Abba saying, Rabbi Abahu, you cannot prove it from that source, because this wasn't a case where, oh, he obviously did what the wife wanted and therefore it really belonged to the wife. It's just that he wasn't intending for it to apply to that. Next question. But if you say it's all about what the person intended, okay, which is what we just said, well, it's just he never intended when I said I'm sanctifying for it to include that. Well, that doesn't make sense then with this source, because it says, if the man says, I'm giving my value to the temple, or it could be a woman. If you don't pay up, they come to your house and they take things away. Now, did you think you meant for them to come into your house and seize items? No way, no how. You never intended it to be on that. And yet it can be on that. So what do you see? It's not about what you intended for it to apply to. Of course, you didn't want that to happen. So now Rabbi Abba is going to fine tune what he says. No, the reason there, again, doesn't have to do with our situation. It's just that anyways, it's as if he basically, before he said the words, I'm sanctifying everything to the temple, it's as if he kind of said, wife, your stuff is going to be yours. Children, your stuff is going to be yours. And then sanctified everything. Even though if he didn't say those words, it's obvious that's what he meant. And therefore, and then that doesn't really have a problem with those other sources. Okay, that was all on the side. We're going to stop here. We still have a little bit of left to the dot, but we'll stop here for today. Then we're going to have another thing about, does the seller have to know who they're selling it to? Okay, that's really the issue we started with, and we'll come back to that tomorrow. So we started with this, do we go by stam etzim, this, and stam yayin that for kedushat shviit? Or do we say it really depends what you're using it for, and then that within reason, it has to be davar sheveh l'chol adam and not something that's only for a certain X percentage of the population. But according to Rabbi Yosi, your intent actually plays a role. It's interesting. We started with intent, we end with intent. Then we got to this sikav Rav Huna, where Rav Yosef got all upset with him. It's a machloket, and then stam. Why do you have to tell us halakha like that? And then we had to explain why he did. Then we brought these two braitot about someone who buys the wrong thing. And then we had two ways of understanding. Was one Rabbi Meir, one Rabbi Yehuda? Were they both Rabbi Meir? And then we could explain they were just different situations. And then we had this side question about how would it work that the buyer, the original person who sent the messenger, would acquire it when the messenger doesn't do what they wanted, and the buyer and the seller has no notion of who the buyer is. They never really acquired it. How did they possibly get a percentage of the profits? And that's what we got into at the end of Daf. With that, we'll stop here for today, and we'll continue with this topic tomorrow. Wishing everyone a good day, hoping to hear more good news. At least we started our morning with some good news. Let's hope to continually be able to get more of the hostages back.